Okay, in this video, I want to talk about really useful actions and selectors and some design patterns. So when I say really useful, these are things that will just save you so much time, and you should just have them sort of in your toolkit at every point, right? So this is, there are, as I mentioned, there's a bajillion different actions, there's a bajillion different selectors, but there's a few that you should really know about because you're going to be using them all the time, and they're really useful. Okay. The first one is the empty action. The empty action is how you can do any amount of computation at any time. An empty action doesn't have any UI element associated with it. The only reason you use the empty action, there are two reasons you use an empty action. Okay, there's three reasons. The first is you just want to do a bunch of computation in the cache. You want to create a bunch of variables, and some of these variables require multiple steps to compute, and you just want to do this without the user knowing it's going on in the background, right? So you use an empty action to save a ton of stuff into the cache, okay? And you have all these variables that you save into the cache. So empty action is your friend. The other reason you use empty action, there's two other reasons, is for delays. Now, why do you want delays? What does this action do, first of all? Empty action takes an optional parameter in its payload called delay, and this is just do nothing for X seconds. That's what this action is doing. Why would you want this? So some of the transitions in Ludio are kind of choppy. And if you don't put delays, things just happen very quickly one after another without much warning. It doesn't give people a lot of time to process. So let me give you an example. You change the layout from an annulus layout to a vertical layout. Okay, I guess we don't do it in this one. That's fine. Let me show you one where we do it. Let me find stone ball, change layout. Okay, so you'll notice here there's an action where we change the layout to a vertical layout, and then there's a delay of 2 seconds. Now, why did I choose to include this? Well, it's because when you change to a vertical layout, it does the change and then it immediately goes to the next action even as the change is happening. So it starts the next action even though the layout change is not complete. Now, you can argue that the real fix for this is just to ask the devs to improve how change layout works so that it truly finishes the layout change and then moves to the next action. That is something we should do, right? But the duct tape, and you will need duct tape because the devs don't implement anything in 0 time, right? You will need some duct tape until it's fixed. So the duct tape is, okay, add a delay, and that ensures that it finishes the layout change, then it goes to the next thing, okay? The other reason you would use an empty action is to play a sound, and you don't really want this sound associated with some other action. Maybe this is a skippable sound, and so you want this empty action to play the sound, but also to have a skip condition so that you can skip the sound in the right situation. So let's try to find one. What's something with a tutorial? Okay, so this is an empty action, and it plays a sound. Okay, and this is how we do tutorials, right? It's a bunch of empty actions playing sounds, and then there's delays between them so that it's not continuous speaking. You give people some time to catch their breath. So empty actions are your friend, delays are your friend. Empty actions let you do computation, they let you play sounds, and they add delays. Let's talk about a couple of selectors that are super useful. There are going to be many times when you need to have a list with one item. Now, why do you need this? Well, let's say you're saving a variable called current player. Current player is the current player. Maybe you're playing a card game and it's turn-based, so the current player represents the player whose turn it is. Now, you've seen that some actions, for their actors and targets, they need a list. So you have this variable, and it's a very useful variable, but it's not a list. It's a single string. And you want to quickly you want to shove it in a list so that you can pass it to the to the actors field in the payload of a create vote action. Then you use create list. Create list just lets you add any number of items into a list. Okay. So There's not much more to say here other than it's just an extremely useful method for making a list with any number of items. Okay, because very often you need lists for the inputs of certain fields. All right, what else is useful? Empty actions, create list. List to string is really useful. So let's say you're debugging and you want to see the contents of a list. The way to do that is to use list to string and call it on that list. It'll turn it into a nicely formatted string, and you can print that in a create notification action. Ludio sometimes complains if you just pass it a list and you expect it to write it out. It won't write it out properly. Okay, so you need list to string for that. Okay. There's one other design pattern that I want to make you aware of. In the before, wait for it. Okay, so every game JSON has this section called before loop actions. This is just a list of actions that gets run once before the game starts. Every single time there's a before loop, I always save these two variables to the cache. I save a variable called players, which is just the list of players. And I save a variable called num players, which is how many of them there are. It's the list length of players. You will need these variables all the time. You are always doing things with the list of players and the number of players. So you might as well just save them to cache so that you can always reference them as cached variables instead of having to recompute them every single time. Okay? Now, when you copy paste from JSONs, you'll start seeing some of these design patterns. So for example, in any turn-based game, there's usually a variable called current player, and you keep updating it and you save it in the cache because you need that variable all the time. Okay, there's usually a variable called host because you need that variable every time you ask people, do you want the tutorial? There are just some things you don't really want to change because you just need those variables all the time. Okay. I think that's the highlight of the useful things, and I'm just thinking if there's anything else. Yeah, I think that's about it.